The lawyer's office smelled like old paper and furniture polish. I sat near the back, away from the rest of the family because that was where I had learned to sit over the past 2 years. My name is Nora, and I had not expected warmth from anyone in that room, but I had also not expected open war. My Aunt Doreen sat at the front like she already owned the place, her posture straight, her hands folded with practiced calm. She wore black, but her eyes were steady, almost pleased, the way someone looks when they believe they have already won. The attorney, Mr. Whitfield, shuffled papers slowly, like he was waiting for something neither of us could yet see. Cousins whispered among themselves. A neighbor, Mrs. Yates, dabbed her eyes even though she barely knew my grandfather personally. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap and stared at the empty chair at the head of the table, the one grandfather used to sit in whenever he ran family meetings. It felt deeply wrong that he wasn't there to open his own will. Aunt Doreen turned slightly and glanced at me, and for 1 second her mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I didn't know yet that smile was a warning. Mr. Whitfield cleared his throat, and the room fell silent almost instantly. Before he could speak, Aunt Doreen stood up, smoothing her dress with one hand. "I think everyone deserves to understand something first," she said, loud enough for the back row to hear clearly. She looked directly at me, her chin lifted. Nora never visited her grandfather. Not once in his final 2 years. While the rest of us were here, caring for him, exhausted and worried, she stayed away completely. Heads turned toward me one by one. I felt heat rise up my neck and settle behind my ears. "That's why," she continued, her voice firm, "he made sure she would receive nothing. He told me himself more than once." Gasps moved through the room like a slow wave. Mrs. Yates shook her head at me with visible disappointment. My cousins exchanged looks that confirmed everything they had already chosen to believe about me. Mr. Whitfield's eyebrows pulled together slightly, but he said nothing yet, watching carefully. I opened my mouth to defend myself, then closed it again, swallowing the words. There were things I could not say out loud. Not yet, not without breaking a promise I had made to a dying man I loved deeply. 2 years earlier, things had been very different between us. I used to visit grandfather every single week, usually on Sunday afternoons when the house smelled like cinnamon tea and old books stacked along the hallway. We would sit together in his study, a room lined with photographs of my late grandmother, and he would tell me stories about his youth, his mistakes, and the family he had carefully built from nothing. He trusted me with things he never told anyone else, not even Aunt Doreen, who he often said talked more than she listened. He once told me, "Nora, you listen like your grandmother did. You don't just hear words, you actually understand them." Those quiet Sunday afternoons were the best part of my entire week, something I looked forward to constantly. He taught me how to fix a leaking faucet, how to balance a checkbook properly, and how to forgive people who didn't always deserve it. I loved him fiercely, the way you love someone who truly sees you for who you are. Back then, Aunt Doreen visited far less than I did, often arriving only for holidays or whenever a photograph needed taking for appearances. No one questioned her absence back then, because no one yet had a reason to doubt the easy story she quietly told. Everything changed the day grandfather called me into his study and quietly closed the door behind us. His face was serious in a way I had never seen before in my life. "Nora," he said, lowering his voice, "I need you to promise me something, and I need you to keep it no matter what anyone ever says about me or about you." I nodded without hesitation, already sensing this mattered deeply. He told me he had been diagnosed with a serious heart condition, one he didn't want broadcast across the family, especially not to Aunt Doreen, who, he said, turns information into ammunition whenever it benefits her. He asked me to stop visiting openly, to let people believe I had quietly pulled away, while secretly helping him manage his health, his appointments, and his growing fears about the future. "If she thinks she controls the story," he said carefully, "she won't bother looking for the truth underneath it." I didn't fully understand his reasoning then, but I trusted him completely, the way I always had. I agreed immediately, even though it meant my reputation within the family would quietly suffer in ways I couldn't yet predict. I only knew that I trusted him more than I trusted anyone else's opinion of me. After that private conversation, Aunt Doreen began appearing at grandfather's house far more often than before. She told the family she had stepped up to take care of him, and almost everyone believed her instantly because that was the story she repeated confidently at every gathering. Slowly, without anyone noticing, she began deciding who could visit and exactly when they were allowed to come. She told relatives grandfather was too tired for guests, then later claimed he was too confused to remember conversations clearly anymore. My visits became secret, arranged quietly through late-night phone calls after she had already gone home for the evening. I would park down the street and walk carefully to the back door, where grandfather would be waiting, sometimes with tea already poured and steaming. He hated the secrecy just as much as I did, but he insisted again and again that it was necessary for now. "She's testing how much control she can take," he told me one night, his eyes tired but alert. "I need to know how far she'll go before I decide exactly what to do about it." I didn't fully understand the danger in his words yet, but I never once questioned him. Despite the secrecy, my visits became the most meaningful part of my entire life that year. I brought him soup when he was too tired to cook for himself, organized his medications into a labeled weekly container, and sat with him during late-night anxiety when his heart raced for no clear medical reason. He never once thanked me with grand words, but his eyes softened every single time I walked quietly through that back door. The world believed I had abandoned him completely, while in truth I was the only person consistently showing up for him. One evening, he handed me a small brass key without much explanation. "This opens the bottom drawer in my study desk," he said simply. "Don't use it yet. Just keep it somewhere safe for now." I slipped it carefully into my coat pocket without asking further questions because by then I trusted his instincts completely and without doubt. Meanwhile, Aunt Doreen continued shaping the family's perception of me at every dinner and every phone call she made. She painted herself as exhausted but devoted, and painted me as distant, ungrateful, and selfish. I heard about these comments secondhand, and each time it stung more than the last. A few weeks after giving me the key, grandfather invited me into his locked study, which Aunt Doreen rarely entered, since he kept it firmly shut whenever she came to visit him. Inside, he showed me folders filled with old letters, financial documents, and photographs spanning many decades of family history. "I want you to understand this family's history," he said quietly, "before you ever try to understand its future." He hinted, carefully and slowly, that someone close to him could not be fully trusted with either money or truth. He didn't say her name directly, but his eyes told me more than enough. "I'm preparing something important," he said. "A final safeguard in case people later try to rewrite what actually happened here." I asked what exactly he meant, but he only smiled gently and told me patience would explain itself eventually, in its own time. That night, he seemed both tired and unusually determined, like a man quietly finishing a long project before time finally ran out on him. I didn't know it then, but those locked study conversations were the quiet beginning of a much larger plan, one he had been building carefully for longer than I realized. Grandfather passed away on a quiet Tuesday morning, peacefully in his sleep without any warning beforehand. Aunt Doreen organized the funeral within days, taking charge of every single detail herself, from the flowers to the seating arrangements at the church. The service, she cried loudly in the front row, accepting condolences like a woman who had sacrificed everything she had for him. I stood near the back again, swallowing grief that had nowhere honest to go because expressing it publicly felt like it would expose secrets I had promised faithfully to protect forever. Mrs. Yates approached me afterward and said quietly, almost gently, "Something doesn't add up, Nora. You were always close to him before. Why do you look this guilty now?" I didn't answer her, because the truth felt far too complicated to explain properly at a funeral surrounded by mourners. Aunt Doreen watched our brief exchange from a distance, her expression completely unreadable to me. After the service ended, relatives praised her devotion warmly and avoided me almost entirely, as though my grief didn't count the same way theirs did. I went home that night feeling completely alone, carrying grief no one else seemed willing to acknowledge as real. In the days following the funeral, Aunt Doreen repeated her story to absolutely anyone who would listen patiently. "I was the one who stayed," she said over and over again, while I quietly endured judgmental glances at every single family gathering we attended together. I never argued back, partly out of grief and partly because I still felt bound to protect grandfather's privacy, even though he was already gone from us. My silence, however, was mistaken for guilt by almost everyone, including people who used to trust me completely without question before all of this began. Meanwhile, Mr. Whitfield began preparing the will for its formal reading in the coming weeks. During a brief phone call, he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that some financial paperwork seemed slightly incomplete to him. "There are gaps I can't yet fully explain," he said carefully. I didn't think much of it then, still numb from sudden loss and exhaustion. But that small comment quietly planted a seed of doubt that would grow significantly once everyone finally gathered together in his crowded office that morning. None of us knew what waited for us there, hidden quietly behind a sealed envelope none of us had yet seen. By the time we returned to Mr. Whitfield's office for the official reading, his earlier uncertainty had grown into something far more visible and concerning. As he reviewed updated documents carefully, he paused several times, frowning deeply at certain pages in front of him. "Before I continue," he finally said, his voice firm, "I need everyone here to remain seated. There appears to be a required step we haven't completed yet today." Aunt Doreen straightened in her chair immediately, visibly annoyed by the sudden delay. "What kind of step?" she asked sharply, her patience clearly thinning. Mr. Whitfield explained that grandfather had filed a sealed instruction with strict conditions, something meant to be opened only during the formal reading, witnessed carefully by the entire family together. The room grew tense almost instantly, filled with curious murmurs spreading from seat to seat. I felt my pulse quicken, remembering the brass key still hidden safely in my drawer at home. Mr. Whitfield's assistant disappeared briefly, returning moments later with a small sealed envelope addressed simply to the family. No one in that room dared to speak while we waited, the tension thick enough to feel in the silence. Mr. Whitfield opened the envelope carefully, revealing both a short letter and a small flash drive tucked inside it. He read the letter aloud, his voice steady but undeniably solemn throughout. "If you are watching this," it began in grandfather's own careful handwriting, "then I am no longer with you, and it is finally time the truth was spoken." The room fell into complete silence, no one daring to move or whisper. Aunt Doreen's hands tightened visibly in her lap. The attorney connected the flash drive to a laptop, and a video file appeared on the screen, dated only weeks before grandfather's sudden passing. My heart pounded as the play button was finally pressed by Mr. Whitfield's steady hand. For a moment, no one in that crowded room seemed to breathe at all. Then grandfather's face appeared, calm and clear-eyed, sitting in the very study I had visited so many secret nights before. Seeing him again, alive and steady on the screen, brought sudden tears to my eyes instantly, without any warning at all. I gripped the edge of my chair and waited, my heart still racing from everything happening so quickly around me. Grandfather's recorded voice was steady, almost gentle, but his words carried unmistakable weight across the silent room. "I know some of you believe a story that simply isn't true," he said, looking directly into the camera lens. "And I know some of you have been lying, even quietly to yourselves, for quite some time now." Aunt Doreen shifted uncomfortably as several relatives glanced toward her with growing suspicion. "For 2 years, I asked Nora to stay quiet about her visits," he continued evenly, "because I needed to understand who in this family could truly be trusted, and who could not be trusted at all." Murmurs spread instantly throughout the room, rippling from chair to chair. My cousins turned to stare at me, their earlier judgment now slowly replaced with visible confusion and doubt. "Nora protected my privacy when I needed it most," grandfather said firmly. "She brought me comfort when others around me brought only quiet control." Aunt Doreen opened her mouth to speak, but Mr. Whitfield raised one hand gently, asking her to wait patiently. She sat back down slowly, her eyes fixed on the screen as though bracing herself for whatever came next. The video moved into specific details next, and grandfather carefully explained exactly why my visits had become secret in the first place. "Doreen began limiting who could see me," he said plainly. telling people I was too tired, too confused, too fragile for any visitors at all. He explained how she had gradually taken control of his schedule, his phone calls, and even his medical appointments, often without his full or willing consent. I allowed it for a while, he admitted honestly, because I wanted to see exactly how far she would take that growing control over me. Aunt Doreen's face had gone visibly pale, her earlier composure now completely gone from the room. Nora, he continued warmly, kept coming anyway, quietly, even when it cost her dearly within this family's opinion of her. Several relatives turned toward me again, this time with something closer to quiet apology in their eyes. Mrs. Yates covered her mouth gently with one hand, clearly stunned. I sat frozen, watching my grandfather defend me from beyond death itself, his calm voice slowly dismantling 2 years of carefully built lies, one sentence at a time. Grandfather's tone shifted slightly, becoming more direct and deliberate than before. "There are records," he said firmly, "that prove everything I'm telling you here today." Mr. Whitfield reached into a folder and pulled out printed visitor logs from the home health aide who had assisted grandfather privately during those final months. The logs showed my name, dated and timed carefully, far more often than anyone in the room had previously assumed was possible. Aunt Doreen's name appeared far less frequently than she had publicly and repeatedly claimed for 2 years. "I kept these," grandfather said in the recording, "because I knew someone would eventually need solid proof of the truth." The room buzzed with quiet disbelief as relatives compared dates aloud among themselves, confirming exactly what the logs clearly showed. Aunt Doreen tried to interject quickly, claiming the logs were somehow incomplete, but her voice wavered noticeably, lacking its earlier confident tone. Mr. Whitfield calmly noted that the logs had been independently maintained by a licensed caregiver, not by either of us personally, removing any doubt of bias. No one argued that point further. As the video continued playing, grandfather addressed something even more serious and troubling than before. "There have also been financial irregularities," he said carefully, "that I want investigated honestly, not hidden out of misplaced family loyalty." Mr. Whitfield confirmed that several withdrawals from grandfather's accounts didn't match his usual spending patterns during the final year of his life. Aunt Doreen's face tightened visibly as specific numbers and dates were read aloud for everyone present. "I'm not accusing anyone outright," grandfather said carefully, his voice still measured, "but I want the truth uncovered fully, whatever that ultimately costs us." The room grew heavier with tension, the earlier gossip now replaced by genuine shared concern among relatives. A cousin asked quietly whether legal authorities would eventually need to be involved, and Mr. Whitfield said that depended entirely on what further review revealed later. Aunt Doreen insisted the withdrawals were simply for household expenses, but couldn't explain specific amounts clearly when questioned directly by the attorney. I watched her composure crumble piece by piece, the very same composure she had once used to publicly humiliate me weeks earlier in that very building. The recording paused briefly while Mr. Whitfield reviewed bank statements he had been provided separately by grandfather's longtime financial advisor. One signature, dated several months earlier, didn't match grandfather's usual handwriting at all, raising immediate concern across the crowded room. "I noticed this discrepancy myself," Mr. Whitfield admitted honestly, but waited for today's instructions before raising it formally in front of everyone. Aunt Doreen denied any wrongdoing firmly, insisting she had simply helped manage paperwork during grandfather's difficult days near the end. However, her explanation grew increasingly inconsistent as more documents were compared aloud by curious relatives. A distant cousin, normally quiet and reserved, spoke up and said the timeline simply didn't match what Aunt Doreen had told the family during earlier visits months ago. The mood in the room shifted entirely, sympathy draining away from her steadily with every new contradiction exposed publicly. I noticed Mrs. Yates watching me differently now, her earlier disappointment slowly replaced by visible quiet regret. I didn't enjoy watching someone unravel completely, even someone who had hurt me deeply, but I understood truth needed room to finally breathe after being buried for so long. Just as tension peaked in the room, Mr. Whitfield introduced someone unexpected, a private caregiver named Odell, who had quietly assisted grandfather during his final difficult year. Odell calmly confirmed everything stated in the recording, explaining how Aunt Doreen had instructed him directly to discourage visitors, including me, while reporting only favorable updates back to the rest of the family. Mr. Bennett specifically asked me to document visits accurately, Odell said steadily, because he suspected someone might try to control the story later on. His calm, professional confirmation carried weight none of us could easily dismiss or argue against. Aunt Doreen's earlier denials suddenly seemed even less convincing than before to everyone listening closely. Odell added that grandfather had once asked him a final important question, which he hadn't shared with anyone until this very moment. He asked me to make sure the family understood that love isn't measured by appearances alone, Odell said quietly, almost gently. The room absorbed that simple sentence in complete silence. For the first time since the meeting began, I saw genuine sympathy directed toward me. Felt strange after 2 long years of quiet suspicion and doubt. Through Odell stepped aside quietly, Mr. Whitfield revealed one final document, a handwritten letter grandfather had written specifically for me, separate entirely from the official will itself. His voice grew thick with emotion as he read it slowly aloud to the room. Nora, the letter began simply. You gave me something money can never buy, consistency without recognition or reward. Tears slipped steadily down my face as he continued reading, describing quiet moments we shared that I assumed only the two of us remembered clearly. I trusted you completely, he wrote, because you never once asked for anything in return from me. The room remained utterly silent throughout, several relatives quietly wiping their own eyes as they listened. Aunt Doreen stared down at the floor, unable to meet anyone's gaze directly anymore. The letter explained that the inheritance wasn't only about money, but about responsibility, character, and the kind of quiet leadership he hoped would guide the family forward after he was gone. Mr. Whitfield paused respectfully, allowing the full weight of those words to settle completely before continuing further. I wiped my eyes and waited for whatever came next, unsure how much more of this I could quietly absorb. Mr. Whitfield then explained the estate's actual structure, which surprised almost everyone present in that quiet room. Rather than dividing assets purely by bloodline alone, grandfather had created specific conditions rewarding demonstrated integrity over the final 2 years, supported entirely by documented evidence already presented to the family. Because of consistent caregiving, verified visitor logs, and Odell's honest testimony, I was named primary trustee over both the estate and a newly established family charitable fund. Aunt Doreen's portion remained intact technically, but was placed under careful financial oversight, given the unresolved questions about missing funds raised earlier. She immediately objected loudly, insisting the entire arrangement was deeply unfair, claiming exhaustion from years of quiet sacrifice that no one had properly acknowledged or thanked her for. Mr. Whitfield reminded her, calmly but firmly, that documented patterns, not personal claims alone, had guided grandfather's final decisions. Several relatives nodded in quiet agreement, finally aligning themselves with facts rather than earlier assumptions. I sat there, overwhelmed completely, not by sudden wealth, but by responsibility I hadn't fully expected to carry on my own. The weight of it settled slowly over me, heavier than any amount of money could ever have felt in that moment. Aunt Doreen's composure finally broke completely in front of everyone watching her closely. She stood abruptly, her voice trembling with anger, insisting the entire family had been manipulated against her through selective evidence and exaggerated testimony presented unfairly. She argued that grief had made everyone unfairly suspicious, twisting ordinary decisions into accusations of dishonesty that simply weren't deserved. For a brief moment, a few relatives hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden intensity of her emotional reaction. However, Mr. Whitfield calmly reminded everyone that the financial discrepancies still required formal review, regardless of personal feelings present in the room that day. Aunt Doreen's frustration only deepened further when no one rushed quickly to defend her, the heavy silence speaking far louder than any argument she attempted to make. She turned briefly toward me, perhaps hoping for some sympathy, but I offered only quiet steadiness rather than triumph or satisfaction. I had no real desire to humiliate her the way she had humiliated me publicly weeks earlier. Eventually, she sat back down slowly, visibly shaken, realizing her carefully built narrative had finally collapsed under undeniable weight. No one moved to comfort her, and the silence that followed said more than any of us could have spoken aloud. Despite everything that had been revealed, I felt no real urge toward revenge, even though plenty of opportunity now clearly existed for it. Several relatives quietly asked whether I intended to publicly confront Aunt Doreen further, expecting satisfaction or retaliation given how poorly she had treated me. Instead, I simply stated that the family had already witnessed enough painful truth for one single day, and further conflict wouldn't honor what grandfather had truly intended for us. Mr. Whitfield seemed unsurprised by my calm response, mentioning quietly that grandfather had anticipated exactly this reaction from me beforehand. "He said you would choose composure over confrontation," he revealed gently, "because he always believed your strength wasn't loud or showy." Hearing that brought fresh tears immediately, knowing grandfather had understood me so completely, even predicting how I would respond after his passing from this world. Aunt Doreen remained quiet throughout, perhaps expecting cruelty that simply never arrived from me. Choosing compassion didn't erase what she had done, but it allowed me to step forward without carrying bitterness as part of my new responsibility. For that, I felt grateful, even amid everything painful that had unfolded across that long, difficult day. The recorded video resumed one final time, grandfather's voice softer now, almost reflective and deeply peaceful. "If you're hearing this," he said gently, "then the truth has likely already been spoken in whatever way it needed to be." He spoke directly about character, reminding everyone listening that legacies aren't measured by inheritance alone, but by how people treat each other when no one else is watching closely. "Nora showed up when it cost her something real," he said warmly. "That matters more than any amount of money ever truly could." He encouraged the family to rebuild trust slowly together, acknowledging openly that healing wouldn't happen overnight after years of quiet division between them. Several relatives nodded, visibly moved by his calm wisdom even now, speaking to them from beyond death itself. Aunt Doreen lowered her head slightly, finally absorbing the full weight of choices she could no longer deny or explain away. The video ended with grandfather thanking everyone warmly for hearing him out, his voice remaining steady until the very last word. Mr. Whitfield closed the laptop gently afterward, allowing silence to settle naturally across the entire room one final time. In the weeks following the reading, Mr. Whitfield confirmed something grandfather had quietly arranged months earlier, a scholarship fund and small charitable trust meant to support families facing health struggles similar to his own difficult journey. He had structured it carefully and deliberately, ensuring it operated independently from the rest of the estate, untouched by any personal disputes within the family. The family was asked to decide together whether to support its continuation, transforming inheritance into shared purpose rather than divided ownership between competing relatives. Several relatives, including ones who had doubted me earlier without question, expressed genuine interest in helping the fund grow steadily over time. Aunt Doreen remained distant during these early discussions, still adjusting slowly to oversight she hadn't expected to face. I didn't push her further, understanding that consequences sometimes teach more effectively through quiet distance than continued confrontation ever could. Slowly, conversations within the family began shifting away from blame and toward rebuilding something meaningful together again. It wasn't full reconciliation overnight, but it was a real beginning, fragile yet genuinely hopeful for all of us involved. I held on to that small hope tightly, even on the days when old wounds still ached quietly beneath the surface. Months passed steadily, and slowly relationships within the family began healing in small, genuine, meaningful ways. Mrs. Yates apologized privately to me one afternoon, admitting she had judged me too quickly without asking any real questions beforehand. A few cousins reached out separately as well, wanting to understand the full story directly from me, rather than relying only on assumptions or rumors. Aunt Doreen and I spoke only briefly during that period, our careful conversations no longer hostile, though still distant. She never fully apologized in words, but her growing silence felt less like denial and more like quiet, honest reflection over time. I chose peace over resentment deliberately, not because forgiveness felt easy, but because carrying constant anger felt far heavier than simply letting it go completely. The charitable fund grew steadily month after month, supported increasingly by relatives who had once doubted its purpose entirely. I oversaw it carefully and patiently, honoring the responsibility grandfather had placed trustingly in my hands. Bitterness slowly faded away, replaced gradually by clarity about who I had truly become through everything that had happened to us. I felt steadier than I had in years, finally able to picture a future that didn't depend on anyone else's approval of me. One quiet afternoon, I returned to grandfather's house, now empty and silent, holding the same small brass key he had given me long ago. I walked slowly into his study, sunlight spilling gently across his old wooden desk and untouched bookshelves lining the walls. Sitting in his favorite worn chair, I allowed myself simply to remember him, not as a mystery finally solved or a hard lesson learned, but as the man who taught me patience, integrity, and quiet, lasting strength. I thought about Aunt Doreen, about forgiveness, and about how easily appearances had once nearly destroyed the truth between every single one of us. I realized that his greatest gift hadn't actually been the inheritance everyone assumed I had simply won that day. It had been trust, responsibility, and the rare chance to prove that genuine kindness outlives deception, even when silence makes it look otherwise to everyone watching. As I locked the study door behind me for the final time that day, I felt something settle quietly within me, not triumph exactly, but peace. I hadn't simply received everything. I had finally understood everything completely, and that understanding, more than any inheritance, was the true legacy grandfather had left behind for me.